his is more in line with actually what the lab is kind of known for doing. But I'm going to be looking more at blood pressure and immunity and also the kidney. So that's kind of what we're getting into. And the title of my talk is Novel Immunotherapy for Hypertension. And I have no disclosures. So one of the lines that you'll probably see on almost every first year grant proposal will be cardiovascular disease is the leading cause of mortality and disability worldwide. We're more interested in hypertension, which is high blood pressure, and it's a risk factor for cardiovascular disease and can result in heart and kidney failure, coronary artery disease, and stroke. It's highly prevalent. Probably every single person in this room has at least 2 or 3 family members with hypertension. And one of the issues is that there's really not a good effective therapy for everyone. Even people that are on 3 hypertensive drugs are still not responsive and still have high blood pressure. So that means we don't know enough and we're not able to treat effectively. So looking more into actually the determinants of blood pressure to actually understand what is underlying changes in blood pressure and what can be targeted potentially. We can get back to basic physics. I know it's really early, but Ohm's law is the potential difference between 2 extreme points of a circuit and the change in voltage. And that's equal to current times resistance. So this is kind of a circuit here. You see on the left, actually I guess I can use that. Oh, there's no pointer. Oh yeah, okay. So on the left, like this is your current generator. On either side, you have your 2 extreme voltages, and then you have your resistance. And if you imagine that the cardiovascular system is quite like a simple circuit, you have your heart, which is your current generator, and responsible for cardiac output. On either sides, you have your extreme pressure difference. You have extremely high pressure in the arterial side and extremely low pressure in the venous side. And then you have your systemic vascular resistance, which is kind of like your small vessels in various locations throughout the body. So does anyone know any potential determinants of mean arterial pressure, actually, which is what we're going to be discussing in a second? Because you can redefine the Ohm's law calculation to be the change in pressure is equal to cardiac output times systemic vascular resistance, and ultimately mean arterial pressure is equal to cardiac output times SVR. Because the venous side is actually so low, so you can just kind of get rid of that pressure difference, and it's really just mean arterial pressure. But does anyone know determinants of mean arterial pressure? You can just shout them out if you have any ideas. Anyone? What, from basic physiology 301, what causes changes in blood pressure? Like big things, big organs. I just kind of mentioned some of them. Yeah?
The kidney.
Yeah, the kidney, yeah. Salt and water handling by the kidney ultimately informs preload, stroke volume, and cardiac output. I just listed a few more. That's from the heart, and then you also have various vascular factors structurally or functionally. So this is kind of displayed here in a nice little graphic. You have your mean arterial pressure. Again, that's kind of informed by cardiac output times SVR, and then that is itself informed by various things, vascular anatomy factors, neurohormonal factors, and then stroke volume, which is a big one, is informed by a lot of different things. And the main essence of this talk will actually be focusing most on blood volume, which is that renal salt and water handling. So I'm not going to get too much into how we got this mutant mouse or why, but we essentially thought that my mutant mice might have this kind of difference in blood pressure, either that they had higher blood pressure or lower blood pressure. We weren't really sure. And so when we actually looked at their blood pressure using this kind of single anesthetized measurement where we kind of put a catheter right inside the heart, just outside the heart in the aorta and then also going into the heart, we found that they did in fact have lower blood pressure. So that's kind of shown here. They have lower systolic blood pressure, these hypo or mutant mice. They have lower diastolic pressure. If you guys remember, mean arterial pressure can also be redefined to be 2/3 diastolic plus 1/3 systolic. So if both are down, their mean arterial pressure will also be down. And they also had reduced left ventricular peak systolic pressure, which means that the amount of blood kind of in the heart that's being ejected is likely less because there's less pressure. And that kind of goes back to the idea of preload. There's less cardiac output, less stroke volume, and that's likely incurred by potentially the kidney salt and water handling. But when we looked again at whether or not they for sure had low blood pressure, the best way to do it is to plant this kind of catheter inside the aorta that kind of stays in the mouse all day and just takes measurements over and over and over again. And these are unrestrained, unanesthetized mice, and you see that throughout the day, they again had low blood pressure, throughout all hours of the day. And to be more translational, we wanted to see, well, are these mice protected from an experimental model of hypertension? So if we challenge them with high blood pressure, do they still have low blood pressure? And in fact, they did. And this is like this DOCA, which is DOCA salt experimental hypertension, when we challenge them. And really this kind of difference was mainly due to the change in baseline blood pressure. So we wanted to figure out at baseline, what is going on in these mice that actually lowers blood pressure and protects them from this experimental model of hypertension.
Sorry, Luke, could I ask a question?
Yeah.
So what is the DOCA model?
Well, the DOCA model is essentially you're giving synthetic aldosterone and you're giving salt. And if you guys remember, aldosterone is a protein that that allows for the body to reabsorb more salt in the kidney tubule. And so if you're giving this kind of synthetic version of the hormone and you're also giving salt, they're going to reabsorb more salt and they should get higher blood pressure, because one of the most known forms of hypertension is primary aldosteronism, which is where they have a lot more of this hormone, and so they're absorbing and reabsorbing more salt, and ultimately they have higher blood pressure. But the good thing to note there is that while some patients have this often genetic defect of primary aldosteronism, most cases, about 95% of cases of hypertension are idiopathic, meaning they have no known cause. So again, that hits at, we really don't know what's going on, and there are likely things that we're not investigating that might be relevant to the pathogenesis of hypertension. And actually, one more question on this. Why do you guys think that it's actually necessary to measure blood pressure, at least in mice, while they're anesthetized versus while they're awake? Does anyone have any ideas? If you're looking at a mutant mouse, something that has all these different problems, versus a regular mouse, why might you look both at the level while they're anesthetized and asleep, but also while they're awake? Any ideas? Yeah. Oh, actually, you want to go for it?
Well, I was just going to say, when you're asleep, your blood pressure is naturally lower. So maybe when they're awake, there's differences between.
I mean, that's true. Actually, you can see that here. Oh, sorry. That the blood pressure is lower actually while they're asleep, because in the mice they're actually reverse the cycles. But the other issue is that people, but often potentially these mutant mice, might have differences in anesthetic sensitivity. So if they're more responsive to the same amount of anesthetic, they might just have lower blood pressure because of that. It will drop their blood pressure more, their heart rate more. So this allows us to make sure that while they're awake, there's no issue of anesthesia. They're literally just kind of measuring all the time. And so getting back to that kind of mean arterial pressure graph where we can look at the different factors that inform MAP, one of them was these vascular factors. And so when we looked at more larger conductance vessels, we kind of thought, well, maybe there's something going on there, maybe they're not behaving normally. And so when we looked at them for different things, like just H&E is just kind of looking at their cell morphology, and then the various other stains here are looking more at fibrosis and collagen. And if anyone knows what fibrosis and collagen is, maybe from histology with Dr. Wilson, essentially it makes it harder for the vessels to kind of dilate. They become more tense, and they should actually have higher resistance if you have more collagen. And that's actually kind of what we saw, weirdly enough, is that these mutant mice had more collagen and more fibrosis. So that's actually the opposite of what we'd expect. We would have thought that maybe they function, better, they could dilate better, or they're more dilated. They're actually more fibrosed. They had higher tensile strength, which is shown in E, meaning that's kind of like a surrogate measure. You see that it took more force to kind of break the artery apart because there was more fibrosis there. And when we looked at the morphology and also the gene expression of the vascular muscle cells, which again allow that kind of constriction but also dilation of the vessel, they were normal. So there's really not much we gained here, except for maybe this is some counter-regulatory increase in fibrosis that accounts or is trying to prevent the low blood pressure in these mutant mice. But then there's another side, there's these small resistance vessels, which are the big determinant of systemic vascular resistance. And so we thought, maybe these are more dilated, maybe they respond more to various known dilators like acetylcholine or nitric oxide. But really, when we looked at their diameter, it was normal. And when we looked at how they respond to pressure or vasoconstrictors or vasodilators, again, it was all normal. So we really didn't learn much at all from the vasculature, which was kind of unfortunate. And we kind of thought it would, be there, but it wasn't. And so, as you guys have all seen and mentioned, the heart is another big performer on, in terms of accounting for mean arterial pressure. So a way that we can kind of look at the heart is through echocardiography. And I think probably all of you guys have heard of it, but essentially you're using ultrasound of the heart. And we also have this little kind of mini ultrasound for mice hearts, where we can look at the structure and kind of the function of the heart to see if maybe there's actually something there. But when we looked at all these different dimensions of the heart, again, there was no change. And oddly enough, there was really no change or no detectable change in stroke volume, heart rate, or cardiac output. So that was really disappointing and a very classic research thing. You look at the two main components and you really didn't see anything. Possibly because there's not enough animals, so it's harder to detect an issue. But likely because we might not have been looking in the right system. And so this is kind of shown here, where you have your technician, which is kind of, if anyone's been in a lab or maybe gets into a lab, there's like a lab manager, a technician, and they're very capable. They get in, they do their job. There's postdocs that generally know what they're doing. They kind of, don't have too much difficulty. And then you're a graduate student and you fail all the time, and it really sucks. And there's usually no one there. But overall, it's actually a very good time. Just sometimes you might be there until 11 p.m., which is shown there. But anyways, as we kind of been hitting at, the last thing that you can kind of look at is maybe preload through the kidney salt water handling. And actually, I like the kidney a lot more than cardio. I was doing kidney work before I came to Mansur's lab, and so I kind of came at this, well, maybe that's what's going on, and so I kind of pushed for this side. And if anyone remembers, you can have an increase in salt and water excretion, which would lower preload, lower stroke volume, lower cardiac output, and ultimately lower mean arterial pressure. So what we expect is, maybe they're excreting more salt and water. And that's actually exactly what we saw. They had an increase in overall urine volume, which is kind of mainly just water, which is 99% water. Creatinine clearance, which is kind of a surrogate for estimated glomerular filtration rate, which is essentially how fast the kidney can filter fluid. So if you're filtering fluid faster and you're excreting more, or if you're filtering fluid faster, generally you can actually excrete more, and so they're excreting more salt and water. And ultimately, they also had an increase in their 24-hour sodium excretion. So they're excreting more sodium per day than a normal mouse. What was also kind of interesting was that we saw, again, this kind of counter-regulatory response, where they said they had an increase in aldosterone excretion, meaning they actually had an increase in aldosterone production, which is, again, counter-regulatory, because as I mentioned before, if you have more aldosterone, you would reabsorb more salt, and you should have higher blood pressure. But in this case, the response or the mechanism is so strong that it doesn't matter that they had increased fibrosis in these large vessels. It doesn't matter that they had increased aldosterone in their blood, ultimately trying to reabsorb more salt and water. They were still excreting a ton of salt and water that was causing this reduction in blood pressure that we saw throughout the day while they were anesthetized. And so, getting more into the kidney, since that's kind of where the issue lay, we looked at, maybe there's just morphological or collagen changes, which again can be measured by Masson. Really, there was nothing. So at that point, we were really scratching our heads, and we thought, maybe there are other factors that are more novel that might be actually affecting the kidney salt and water handling. And so that's when we kind of, started doing more research and looking into it. And we found that maybe the immune system actually may regulate this. And that kind of idea started floating around in 2015-ish, that, immune cells might have direct effects on either sodium transporters in the kidney and ultimately sodium salt water and on blood pressure. So to be holistic about it, we looked at all different types of immune cells. We looked at just CD45 positive leukocytes, which are essentially all immune cells. We looked at neutrophils. If you guys remember, that kind of like that first immune cell, usually in a acute response. Macrophages, which are those kind of guys that eat everything up and ultimately set up the immune response for the adaptive immune system quite often. And then there's two different types of CD4 and CD8 T cells. If you guys have learned, CD4 are more, they kind of help, they're assisters, whereas CD8 are more effectors. And ultimately B cells, which are mainly known for their roles in like infection and secreting antibodies, we were actually interested to find that they were the only ones reduced in the kidney. And these mice, I didn't show it before, but they also did have a reduction in the blood of B cells and also T cells. So we were kind of surprised that only in the kidney did they have this reduction in B cells and not T cells. And so that kind of led us to think, well, maybe the B cells are a central player in this mouse and this salt water phenotype. But again, that's just speculation. Once you just show that there's a change in these immune cells, you need to prove that the immune cell is actually responsible for this salt water phenotype. And so I won't get too much into this, but there was a very complicated experiment that we ran where we essentially mixed the bone marrow of two different mice. We had one where it was a regular mouse, and then we mixed it with a mouse that had absolutely no B cells, these JHT mice. And then we did the same thing with our mutant mouse. We took a mutant mouse and we mixed the bone marrow with a mouse that had absolutely no B cells. We irradiated mice, which kind of depletes the entire bone marrow. So they are immune cells, they have nothing, and you can allow them to reconstitute if you give them bone marrow. So then we did that in these kind of just regular normal mice. And so on this side, these mice here would only get B cells from our mutant mice. And on this side, this mouse here would only get B cells from wild type regular mice. And the idea we're trying to show is that if we just gave the B cell compartment of our mutant mouse, can we actually elicit the same response? And indeed what we found was that when we measured again by this kind of non-anesthetized, unrestrained measurement of blood pressure, we found that throughout the day, these mice that received just the B cell compartment from our mutant mouse also had lower blood pressure, and they also excreted more salt and water, right here. Really trying to show that just giving the compartment of B cells likely is causing the phenotype. And again, in these mice, just to kind of make sure, they also had lower B cells in the blood, right there, and lower B cells in the kidney. All kind of evidence to suggest that their compartment is impaired, and that likely just by giving this mutant compartment, that indeed it causes increased salt and water excretion. But the one issue here with this experiment is it doesn't get at whether or not it's the unique function of B cells in the mutant mouse, or if it's just getting rid of the immune cells. Because one of the issues with this is that you see that, yeah, they have a depleted department of B cells here, but they also might be somewhat functionally unique. We didn't really know. So the way to kind of get at that is to take a mouse that has absolutely no B cells, which was this JHT mouse here, and check if they have the same phenotype, if they have the same response. Because then that really means that if they're just gone, and there you go, that's it. You just have to get rid of them, and in that way, you cause the same thing. And actually, that's exactly what we saw. If you just get rid of B cells, and these B cell knockout mice, they also had lower blood pressure, both systolic, diastolic, and LV peak systolic. And as we'd expect, I didn't mean to have both of those come up. As we'd expect, we also had this increased excretion by the kidney. So again, almost all these phenotypes have been recapitulated. We've shown that by just giving a compartment of B cells from the mutant mouse that again, it kind of lowers blood pressure and increases excretion of salt and water. And then when we just got rid of B cells, with the B cell knockout, we saw the exact same thing. Which is interesting because that means that they're normally there serving a function in the steady state to reabsorb salt and water, which is entirely novel. You know, why the sentinel immune cell in the kidney might just be there in addition to all our tubule cells that are actually kind of serving a very critical function in the reabsorption of salt and water. And so mechanistically, we wanted to see, well, maybe these mutant and also these JHT B cell knockout mice also have something similar. Maybe there's a channel or a receptor in the kidney tubule that is impaired or being regulated by B cells normally. And so if anyone remembers from physiology, what is vasopressin receptor 2? Does anyone know? Come on, I know you all learned it from James Scully. If you took PSL 301, you should, yeah?
It's to reabsorb water.
Yeah, exactly. That's the main canonical function, is to reabsorb water. What's becoming more known is that it also affects salt handling as well. And there's some studies to show that if you just give synthetic, ADH or vasopressin, which binds to the receptor, that people reabsorb more salt. So we thought maybe this receptor is impaired. Maybe B cells are doing something normally to actually maintain the expression or the activity of this receptor, which would actually cause normal salt and water handling. And one thing to note about V2R, or vasopressin receptor 2, is that it also affects other proteins. It affects a lot of different channels throughout the tubule that normally regulate salt. So if this thing is down, that means all the other functions of these different salt transporters are also down. And that makes sense because even though aldosterone was high, it didn't matter. There was still an increase in salt and water. And so when we looked at, in these mutant mice and these JHT mice that again have no B cells, we actually found that the gene expression of this receptor was down in both of them. And that's kind of the first causal evidence, associative evidence, to show that if they had less of this receptor, that does in fact underlie this kind of increased excretion of salt and water, and also the lower blood pressure. It all kind of tied together in a nice line. And so that's really what we've been going with and trying to figure out moving forward. And if you guys have questions about what I'm doing now, we can kind of talk about that after. But that's kind of the main essence of what we just recently published. And now we're kind of creating grants and doing some more preliminary work on how exactly B cells causally regulate V2R to then elicit these phenotypes. And so in conclusion, our data really suggests that there is this novel, entirely unknown relationship between B cells, blood pressure, and renal salt and water handling. And ultimately defining how B cells might affect blood pressure may lead to this kind of immunotherapy approach. And by that I mean not necessarily depleting B cells or T cells or some large player, but more so getting at, what is the B cell doing? Is it secreting a different cytokine, or is it acting with another immune cell that then secretes a cytokine to regulate this protein? You want to get at the smaller factor so that you can create these small molecule antagonists, and that's more therapeutic. So that's kind of what we're trying to get at, and ultimately, hopefully, we'll find. And I think I was also supposed to talk about more also, how I got to where I am now, so I'll quickly go through that. So I started research primarily in my third year with Dr. Marcus Seltzner. I don't know if you guys have heard of him, but he's a liver and kidney transplant surgeon at UHM. And he's doing some really, really amazing, cool work. I was very fortunate. I had a mentor starting in my second year that actually kind of stuck her neck out and helped me get this spot where I kind of served first as like more of an observer, but more as an assistant to the surgeries and the kidney transplants in pigs. And what they were trying to do was to show that rather than putting a transplanted organ on ice, which is the gold standard approach, and then you transplant it, ultimately what they were trying to do is put it in this basin that would be given, warm, and complete media that had kind of everything that the normal kidney would have. So it would have glucose, it would have different electrolytes, it would have 37-degree fluid, and essentially circulating the kidney the whole time for hours, 6 to 12 hours, and I'm just sitting there also watching this kidney for 12 hours sometimes. And then we'd ultimately transplant it. And what was interesting was that we found that by doing so, by keeping it warm and alive and in a normal condition, these kidneys were actually much more effective right after you grafted them. There was less injury. They were, you could also measure the metabolites while you were actually placing the kidney in this basin, which was important because a lot of the times when you transplant a kidney, you're just looking at it and you're like, oh, okay, this doesn't look that great, we're just going to discard it. This actually gave people a measure of, is it actually good or bad, and can we improve it? So that's kind of a better way because of the big donor shortage. Not many people donate or have an effective donor kidney. So by being able to kind of improve the function of kidneys that might have been discarded, or know that they should discard or not discard, was also a really interesting thing. So I did that for my third year summer and also my fourth year project, and I was very lucky to be on 2 papers. And then when I was in my fourth year summer, I was with Dr. Mucci, and as I kind of mentioned, I was doing a lot of kidney work before, and this was more clinical. So I kind of wanted to see if clinical research might be interesting. And so his work was mainly focused on looking at whether or not there were more social determinants of health or social factors or anything related to that might be actually affecting outcomes of kidney transplant, but also dialysis. And there was also kind of a unique package called Explore Transplant Ontario, which was where we would kind of engage patients in dialysis centers and see, what's the level of knowledge in these patients, and maybe why are certain patient populations or races not choosing kidney transplant or dialysis. So that was really the main purpose, and I was lucky again to have a few abstracts, and then most recently, this is my PhD work, and that, as I mentioned, we just kind of published everything that you saw there. There's, if you want to kind of look back at what there's, throughout that presentation, if there's something unclear, almost everything will be in the paper. You can reread it or read it, and that might help you there. But I think that's about it. So thanks to Dr. Ju and Yumbao, and these are all my lab, my collaborators, and my funding.
Okay, we have time for a couple of quick questions. If there's anything that you need clarified or just general questions about research trajectories, why PSL 301 is your best friend.
It's definitely a useful course. If anything, I think I use that course by far the most of any of the courses. Yeah?
Did you always want to go into research?
No, I did not. I actually had a really bad first research experience, which actually isn't even listed in my career and graduate life. My first research experience, was terrible. I was in my second year, and I had a decision between clinical and basic, and I thought basic would be super cool and interesting. So I went with that, joined a terrible lab that the PI was never there, and I was kind of being managed by a lab manager. And that really sucked and sent me back a while. But what really inspired me was these 2 products here. And I kind of saw that this is like the best case scenario of research. You're doing something that's in a large animal, you're doing something that's highly translatable, and honestly, I didn't feel like I was doing any work at all. Like, it was awesome. I would do my 4th year, and then as soon as I was finished, I would just go to the lab, help with surgeries, do intubations and stuff. It was super, super interesting, and that's kind of what inspired me to do more research. And now, I still want to do research. So after my PhD, I'm hopefully doing medicine next year, and I want to be a clinician scientist. So I kind of want to do both, because while medicine is good, and I'm sure a lot of you want to do medicine, it doesn't help as many people as you may think. Research ultimately helps the world. while it's silly to think that, you know, this paper in mice really has any impact, you're adding to a kind of pool of data that ultimately, when you have like 20 papers saying the same thing, or people look at it a different way, that ultimately builds, and then you get a translational discovery that affects a lot of people. Or you're doing, you know, work for a patient population where there's essentially no one investigating anything. And it could be like a rare population where there's not a good treatment plan. And so the only way to actually get at a good treatment plan is through research. So that's kind of why I still want to do it. And I think it's, yeah, definitely worthwhile. Yeah?
Was it harder to get into clinical research?
To clinical research? No, if anything, it's easier. So if you want to get into clinical research, it's actually a lot easier because they usually need more hands. With undergraduate, like basic science research, it's a lot harder because sometimes, you know, depending on the lab, people might not trust you as much, and also they don't often need as many people. But with clinical research, you have to interact with so many different patients, and, you know, give out forms and do different tasks, like how people do surveys usually. So just for the sake of manpower, you have a lot higher chance if you approach a clinical lab than a basic science lab to get a position. And it's nice to see both sides. Like if you've been trying for basic science and you can't get one, and then you want to see clinical, I think it's worthwhile. Because I actually really enjoyed the clinical side. I really liked talking to patients. The only issue was I didn't really like the work. I didn't really personally associate too well with it. And so that's kind of why I'm switching. Yeah. Any other questions?
Okay, so, okay, great, thanks again.